Okay. Well, good morning, Saints again, or good afternoon, Saints again. And wanted to praise the Lord again, for your being here. And wanted to start today with with part of a question that came up yesterday that our brother Barnabas brought up in terms of um, the place of Africa in the Bible, and also why why aren't is Africa is Africa under punishment forever, which the answer is no. But also, why isn't it that we hear about this? Well, one of the things that I shared yesterday was that it's just the way the West has arranged the narrative over several centuries. And also, what happened is that because of that, and because of the focus on Europe, there was a loss of history of the past in other parts of the world. So those things are happening. There's two things that are happening. One is that the resurgence that we talked about yesterday in Africa of Christianity, that Africa is now the world center of Christianity, and it's growing. There's another thing that's happening too, is that even outside of the church, there is a power shift that is going on globally. And one of the things that we that comes to mind with the history of the church is that as nations and areas of the world have turned to the Lord, and God has started saving people, that there's been a sort of a commensurate, parallel sort of rising of different uh, economic and other types of influence that are going on. And sometimes it's not direct, and sometimes it is. But one of the things too wanted to share about what's going on, with Africa. I have a few books here. Um, one is this. It's called the Africa Study Bible. And this is a study Bible that has been published, and all of the footnotes in it are from African scholars. So these are Bible-believing African scholars, and this is sort of the spine of it. There's also another book coming out that is out already, and there's a second edition, and this is called the Africa Bible Commentary. And so this is another 70 scholars, and it's let's see, it's Takonbo Adeyemo is the general editor, and the first edition is out and it's in print. There's a second edition coming out as well. So, and they're not the first. There's a brother here named if you're familiar with John S. Mbiti, I think he's a Kenyan scholar, and he's a Christian brother. He was a Lutheran, and he wrote two really seminal books called Concepts of God in Africa, and also um, African Traditions and Religions, I think the other one was called. Um, African Religions and Philosophies. That's what it's called. And what he does is that he started this back in like the 1970s, and started showing some parallels between traditional African beliefs, pre-Christian African beliefs, and also concepts of God, and how it became easy in some ways for the gospel to spread in Africa, because some of the concepts were already parallel. One is that, according to him, across the continent, most of the peoples and civilizations believed ultimately in one supreme being, or one supreme God, maybe in a pantheon, maybe distant and not really interacting with the world in their particular worldview, and so they would reach more through ancestors or through spirits or whatever. But that, and then also in northern Africa and Egypt particularly, there were some concepts of afterlife and living again after you die. And so what the Christians were able to do, the apostles and the early Christians were able to do, was to help people see, look, this is partly on track, what you believe is partly on track. But here's the right way, that there is one God who believes, who interacts with this world, who we can reach and talk to personally, and who actually came down with us, incarnated as a man. He died, rose again, and that we're going to be resurrected in the general resurrection. And so that influence has been there. A lot of that has been lost, but it's being recovered by brothers like the ones that I had shared with you. There's another thing, too, I'd like to just share that's happening um, in Africa with some very rather amazing amazing impacts that are going on. Hold on, let me see, share. Uh, okay, here. All right. And this is um, outside in or of in addition to Christianity coming, is that there is a rise in different nations that where Africa is reasserting itself and shaking off a lot of the colonial economic um, uh, imprisonment that has been going on, and some of the vestiges of that. Some of it is led by uh, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. And from his leadership, there have been the Sahel nations, which are mostly Muslim, but also Christian nations like Rwanda, Burundi, and so forth, have been doing things like raw materials export bans, making sure that uh, that that people can't just come from other countries and dig up the ground, take it out of Africa, and then do all of the valuable processing to it there. That has to be done in the continent. And there's been a number with Nigeria, and Nigeria is a mostly Christian country. Zimbabwe, Ghana, these are all Christian countries. Botswana, the Sahel, which is more Muslim, and so forth. And there's about 10 or more countries that have started doing this. So what's happening is that the um, the Christian um, ethos, or the Christian um, idea of equality of people, of fairness, of and that includes not only within the church but outside of the church and society. Those ideas are are making seeds, are planting seeds, and helping different things happen that are bettering the lives of many African people, and also providing a better promise for a future if people stay with the Lord and keep going. Another thing too is like Rwanda. Rwanda, there's some articles here about Rwanda launching Africa's first self-flying taxi. So this is a flying car. And there's different articles about it. You can read them as well. But it's really amazing things that are going on. There's Burkina Faso has developed an electric car that is suited for African terrain, and that has solar power, that has large battery life. It's designed and built by African engineers within the country. And then also things like, again, these raw export bans. There are channels that you could, if you want to see this part of it, there are channels like, what's the name here? This Africa Reloaded is one of them. I was looking for another uh, one. I can send you it. It's called Black Culture Diary is the name of the YouTube channel. And that's where we got a lot of this information, and my wife and I, when we started watching it. But what's happening is that the seeds that God plants through the gospel, often what they do is that they change people's hearts. And when people's hearts are changed, then the way people behave are changed. And especially, and even when the people have power, that if God changes the hearts of people in power, that that will change the lives of people for the better. So that's something that is still, needs to happen more, and it's really at its beginning phases. But this is one of the ways that the gospel is helping to influence uh, the situations and improving the lives of ordinary people. So that's one thing. Another thing I wanted to share from yesterday was we talked um, about biblical Ethiopia, which is Sudan, and we talked about African Egypt being in the Bible. There's also a couple of more data points I wanted to share with a third African people that are in the Bible, and that is Cyrene. And we've heard about Simon of Cyrene, who was compelled by the Romans to help Jesus Christ bear his cross. And also, he was the father of two prominent, very faithful saints in the early church, which are Alexander and Rufus. That's all mentioned in Mark 15, verses 21. Now, another thing that is not known that needs to be understood even better, even as well, rather, is that Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, was an African brother. He was from Cyrene, and that was his origin. And then his family moved from Cyrene to Jerusalem. And he was sent by Peter in the early church to actually start the church in Africa, in Alexandria, in African Egypt, back in that day. So we learned yesterday about Zephaniah, who was half Ethiopian or half Sudanese. And now we can learn now about one of them. He was an author of an Old Testament book, an Old Testament, and he was an Old Testament prophet. And so now we can know that Simon of Cyrene, or not Simon of Cyrene, but Mark was from Cyrene and helped, and God used him to write the Gospel of Mark, and then to actually start the church in Alexandria, in Egypt, in African Egypt, as we'll see in just a minute. So now, I'd like to start to go to the church in Africa, which is the history of the church in Africa, which is our subject for today. So we'll start with the history of Jews in Africa during the Old Testament and New Testament times. So there was actually Jewish presence in Africa. It's one of the lesser known, but it's significant threads in biblical history. So we saw Egypt as a center of Jewish life. What happened is that between the intertestamental, there were several things that happened historically, dispersions and of Jews from Israel. And this was when the Jews were taken out of Israel by Babylon and by Assyria in what's called the exile period. So the exile of the Jews. What happened is that during those times, the Jews that were going into exile, those armies were invading. And what happens, of course, is that not everyone stays to see the consequences of the battle and to see the invasion happen and the sieges and famines and all of that happens. So people flee from the oncoming armies, or they escape in other ways, and then they disperse. And so that's what happened to Jews as well in Africa, in Jerusalem. And some of them went, most went into exile, into Assyria and Babylon, of course, but many also scattered and ended up in different parts of Africa. Now, there are two very prominent, one of which is well known. There were diaspora in Northern Africa during New Testament times. Starting again, there became a large community of Jews of African Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, and some of them were Jews from Palestine, but also they ended up intermarrying with the African Egyptians there. And so there was a community that started developing over a couple of centuries. And it was started around the time of Alexander the Great in around 323 BC, when Alexander conquered most of the known world at that time. And then he died. And then after that, his kingdom was divided into four parts for his four sons, and his son Ptolemy was the one that inherited the kingdom, or ruled that part of the kingdom that had conquered Africa and Alexandria and African Egypt. So now, so at that time, it became a big center of Jewish culture and learning. So this African city became a big center of Jewish culture and learning, and it was a very ripe place for the gospel to be shared after Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And then the apostles and disciples started sharing the gospel with Jews only at first, and then later on with Gentiles. So another one is that there is a tradition from modern Ethiopia, which was called Axum. So the kingdom of Axum back then was what's called modern Ethiopia today. In modern Ethiopia, of course, and biblical Ethiopia are two different places. Sudan versus modern Ethiopia and Eritrea and so forth. So, but there was a, a long community of African Jews in modern Ethiopia that were called that are now called Beta Israel, but were called Falasha back then when they were first discovered by some outside, Europeans and so forth that ended up publicizing their existence. And many of them actually were transported from modern Ethiopia into Israel. There were about 54,000 of them overall estimated, and about 34,000 of them as of 2021, year 2021, about 34,000 of them had been relocated into Israel proper. And they were Jews. They were observing the Torah, the Jewish tradition and customs, ancient ones that they had gone to themselves, that they had inherited from their forefathers, and they were pronounced by the chief Sephardi rabbi of Israel as being the tribe of Dan. And so they are there in Israel today, and there's still some in modern Ethiopia today. Another one that is not as well understood and not as well advertised and not as widely known is the Lemba people of South Africa. And the Lemba people of South Africa actually had DNA testing, and they had genetic links to the tribe of Levi, or the priestly tribe from ancient Israel. And they are still in South Africa today. There's about 70,000. They still observe many of the traditions and customs and dietary restrictions from the Jews that they had inherited from their forefathers. The difference between the Lemba and the Beta Israel from modern Ethiopia and the Lemba in South Africa is that the Lemba in South Africa today are mostly Christians and Jews, Christians and Muslims. So these are two, and that's actually two different interesting comparison. So there's a comparison because the Beta Israel had stayed with the ways of Jews, and they had not turned to Christianity in modern Ethiopia, which has been a Christian nation since the 4th century. But on the other side, the Lemba in South Africa had turned to Christ, who is the Jewish Messiah, and had accepted him. Many of them, others went to Islam, but many of the Lemba had accepted Jesus Christ, the Jewish Messiah. And so those are the history of some of the Jewish presence in Africa from ancient times, now up to modern times. Now, a history, now we can start in our history of pre-European Christianity in Africa. So really, Africa, as we'd seen, had actually taken deep root in Christianity, or Christianity had taken a deep root in Africa in various regions of the continent. And there were four major regions where Christianity, actually, it was much of the continent. There's four major ones, but there's four major ones, which is Northern Africa, which is Carthage and Cyrene, that area, the area of Egypt, which is or African Egypt, and before the Arabs came, and then of course biblical Ethiopia, which is Sudan, and that Christianity went down into South Sudan as well, and then also the Axumite kingdom, which is modern Ethiopia. But there's also a fifth area of Christianity that was pre-European, and that is in moving west across Africa from Nubia or Sudan all the way over to actually Lake Chad and Niger and beyond that. So let's start with Egypt, African Egypt, and this is the cradle of the 1st century. So another thing too is that we will see is that Africa actually helped form and articulate a lot of the liturgy, which is what the ancient church actually called worship. And liturgy is really the way that worship services are conducted. It's the way the scriptures that are read. It's the prayers that are made. It is the calendar of observations for the different heroes of the faith, who are called saints. It is the some of the theology and around there. Those liturgies vary across the world, and they're localized. There's liturgies around the Byzantine, what are called the Orthodox liturgies, and the Orthodox Church has about 14 different liturgies around the world. They tend to be more nationalized and regionalized in their observations. And there's also Catholic liturgies. There's about actually 25 different Catholic liturgies. The Latin Mass is the one that we're familiar with most, but there's also about 24, there's 23 more. There's actually 24, sorry. So there's about 23 others that are Eastern, more toward the Orthodox, and different ways of worshiping, different orders of service, different things and prayers and religious calendars and so forth. So those are so Africa actually helped form much of the church liturgy and much of the theology of the early church and articulating the theology of the apostles. One is the prominent example is the articulation of the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. So in 325 AD, there was the Council of Nicaea, as we know. And what that did was to articulate the deity of Christ very clearly as in opposition to the Arian heresy, which denied that Jesus Christ was God, but and instead said that he was a very, very elevated creation, which he isn't. He's much more than that. He's God incarnate. So the Council of Nicaea did that. Now, later on, there was in 381, there was the Council of Constantinople, and that is where the doctrine of the Holy Spirit started to become articulated. And there was a brother named Saint Athanasius of Alexandria. He was an African Christian brother, and he was a hero, a lion, a hero of the faith. And so his articulations and writings of who the Holy Spirit is and how he is related and interacting with the other two persons of the Trinity within the essence of God, the Trinity, that became part of the articulation of the what's now the Nicene Constantinople Creed. And so that was a huge contribution, of course, to our faith and to clarifying what it is that we believe from the scriptures. So in before Christianity arrived in Egypt, there was, of course, Judaism. But before that, and alongside that, there was a pantheistic type of religion, of course, as we know. And there's these deities such as Osiris, Isis, rather, Horus, and Amun-Ra, and those dominated the official and popular religions of the day before the gospel came. And so they were actually modified a bit to suit the Greek conquerors who conquered them and wanted to, and the Romans before then. So the Greeks conquered um, Northern Africa in 323 AD, and then the Romans, 323 BC, sorry, and then the Romans conquered the Greeks and therefore took over that part of the world, that part of Africa, in 31 BC. So at that time, they also tried to impose some of their religions and some of their gods, their pantheon, onto the African Egyptians, and the African Egyptians actually sort of conceded with that. Now, later on, they tried to impose those same types of pantheons onto the African Christians, and the African Christians refused, and they were martyred. They were killed in large numbers because they refused to adapt compromised the faith of Jesus Christ to this Roman pagan pantheon. So what happened was that as far as around 42 AD, Mark the evangelist brought the gospel, including the gospel that God had inspired him to write, to Alexandria. And he became the city's first bishop. He was sent by Peter and Peter was the bishop of Rome at the time, and ended up being a martyr. Mark was martyred in Alexandria. So there's a brother named Eusebius of Caesarea, and I have in the class syllabus, there's a link to this very important work. It's Eusebius's History of the Church, and that's one of the most important documents for understanding how the early church thought, what the early church history was, and what happened to many of the figures that many of the people that the Bible introduces us to, what happened after their lives. It talks things about like Simon Magus, who had a false conversion. He's called the was it the progenitor of heresies or the father of all heresies, so forth. And then also what happened to John, John the Apostle after the Bible days and so forth. In the early persecutions, some of these persecutions were just horrible. They were beyond imagination almost. But what people actually lived and suffered for the faith, and also how successful they were against heresies, against heretics, and against arguing against the pagans, defending the faith. Origen, for instance, he was an African theologian, and he ran the University of the Catechetical School of Alexandria, and he was a very avid, very advanced scholar and a very avid defender of the faith. He ended up becoming a martyr also. So for the first century, it was a very Jewish. It was both Jews and Gentiles were being converted, starting, of course, with the Jews in Alexandria. It became an intellectual and spiritual center for Christian intellectual life. And again, this catechetical school of Alexandria is the earliest and oldest known Christian theological school. And it was the major center of Christian education for the clergy, for theology, for the first 1,000 years of the church, as we had shared yesterday. There were leaders like Pantanius, Clement of Alexandria, and the great Origen, and they produced a great body of biblical exegesis, philosophical theology, and they also influenced a lot of the thought and and um, and thinking and theology of the rest of the church. That there were about 5 or 6, depends on what time of history, but there were 5 to 9 different, 5 to 9 churches around the Mediterranean. The Church of Rome was sort of the chief justice of the Supreme Court, as you will. The main churches were Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And all of those were called Petrine sees because Peter had been there. He had founded all of them. So he was the pastor of the Church of Antioch at first. And then he was the pastor, the bishop he was the bishop of Antioch. And then he became the bishop of Rome and moved there. And that's where he was martyred. He was crucified upside down. He and Paul were both martyred there. And then also from there, he sent Mark to found the Church of Alexandria. And so those were called the 3 Petrine sees. And actually, Alexandria and Rome were about equal in authority. Rome was sort of the final, a court of appeals for the other churches, but really the authority and and patriarchy, both were called popes. There was the Pope of Alexandria and the Pope of Rome. The other churches were called patriarchs, which means the same thing. Basically, it means father. And so that is the axis of theological thought, really centered around it was around Alexandria and Antioch, which had different ways they had different emphasis and focuses on interpreting the Bible. So in Antioch, it was more of a literal. sort of, historical, literal type of approach that we talked about more in the hermeneutics course. And then in Alexandria, what they did was they took that one step further, was that they would take the literal truth of the Bible and then come up with a lot of allegorical and theological insights to make the Bible applicable more to everyday life and to speculate about the spiritual realm, and then also to address some of the societal thought from these pagan religions that were still there at the time. And so that was sort of the axis, and then the theology developed mostly between Alexandria and Antioch, and then Rome was sort of the center of sort of ecclesiastical, wouldn't say ecclesiastical power, but ecclesiastical arbitration of the different disputes or different opinions that came up from the different churches. So then as far as the early worship of the church, the earliest Christian archaeological remains are fragmentary, but they're significant. And what happens, there's papyrus documents from a place called Oxyhincris, other side. They date back to the 2nd and 3rd century, and they talked about the Christian communities and their leaders. And this Oxyrhynchus site in near Alexandria, Cairo, it has over 5,000 different fragments and um, correspondence and theological works. They found fragments of Mark and all four the different gospels. They found fragments of the Old Testament from Genesis to the prophets, and also ecclesiastical writings, commentaries, and so forth. There, it dates back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, one of the things that comes up sometimes is when things happen, like the Ethiopian eunuch going to coming back to Sudan, and then Sudan actually becoming a Christian kingdom several centuries later, or even in Europe or in Rome, where there's a lot of speculation from secular people about there's no records of these of contemporary records of Jesus, which the Gospels really are soon afterwards. But what happens is that whether it's in African Egypt or in Sudan or wherever, there's two different ways that Christianity actually takes hold in the nation. One is that the kings get converted, and that happened. That happened in Congo. In Congo, which is now Mali and so forth, the Kingdom of Congo. It happened in Nubia and some other places, but that's one way that that when the kings become converted, and that actually happened in modern Ethiopia. So that's one thing, and then it sort of gets pushed down into the population. That's one way. Another one, though, is that's sort of a top down. There's also a bottom up that happens more often, which is that the gospel really appeals to the ordinary person, and especially people that are poor, people that are uh, marginalized, people that don't really have a lot in this world. They see the hope of the gospel and the riches of the next life. So what happens is that, and as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he says that there's not many wise among you, not many of the leaders of society, but it's the poor, the ordinary people among you who are among you as Christians. Origen actually has a book. He wrote a book called Against Celsus, and Celsus was this pagan, and he said that Christianity only seems to appeal to the poor, the ignorant, and to children. Right? I mean, he was very disparaging. Um, uh, but what that does is that it shows what Jesus said. He came to preach the gospel to the poor, and so to open the eyes of the blind and so forth, right? And that's from Isaiah. And So what happens is that many times Christianity works its way from the bottom up. It becomes sort of a spiritual movement in among the ordinary people, the working classes, the enslaved, and so forth. And then it will percolate up the societal hierarchy to the royalty. That's the way that it happened in Rome. So what happened so even though so back to this is that one of the reasons that some of these findings of early Christianity are fragmentary is because they weren't preserved by the hierarchies and the governments and the kings and the more powerful in society. So we see there these funerary inscriptions and symbols, such as the Christian symbol, the fish symbol, appearing in catacombs and cemeteries around Alexandria and around Fayum. And Fayum is around 100 miles southwest of Cairo. That's actually where we talked yesterday about where the foundations of African Egyptian civilization were actually formed with the people there who were settlers, and these were the black-skinned Africans, and then the lighter-skinned Africans were the ones who were more nomadic. But around that Fayum Depression, around that Fayum area, there were a lot of these artifacts found of early Christianity in African Egypt. So there were other highlights as well. So within African Egypt, there were things like these are archaeological finds that have been made over, say, the past century or so. One is the red and white monasteries near Sohag, and Sohag is around in Upper Egypt. It's on the west bank of the Nile, about 470 kilometers south of Cairo. And these monasteries actually date back to the 5th century, and they have huge basilicas, large worship areas, painted walls, libraries of Coptic manuscripts, and then the White Monastery in particular had over 4,000 monks at its prime. And also, what happened in African Egypt is that African Egypt is also the originator of, it is where the monastic discipline actually formed in the church. So there was a brother named Saint Anthony, and there was actually earlier in African Egypt Christianity, there was a movement among some of the saints there to withdraw from the world, to meditate on the Bible, on the scriptures, on God. And these, of course, were monks, and they became monks. And so that became a popular movement there, and it became popular enough. Like there was Saint Anthony, who was like the founder of sort of like the godfather of monasticism in African Egypt. And then following him, one of his disciples was a brother, an African Egyptian brother named Saint Pachomus or Pachymonius, and he actually took it next step further and started monastic communities. So where Saint Anthony was um, guiding monks who were by themselves in the desert or in the mountains, Saint Pachymonius actually was building communities of monks and actually nuns, like female monastics as well, and he was helping them build. And this spread very the word of this. It really helped the population. It helped the Christian population. It helped the believers really solidify their faith because they looked at these monks as being sort of heroes of the faith, or of being the uh, the ones that really, really embraced the faith, and they became role models for the rest of the Christians in the area, even if they didn't, even the ones that most didn't become monks, but the monks were role models. And this monastic Christianity in Africa was so impactful that actually the churches in Russia uh, asked for saints from Africa, from African Egypt, to come up to Russia and teach them how to do the monastic disciplines, how to be monks, how to organize monasteries, and so forth. So the whole movement of monasticism in Christianity actually originated in Africa, in African Egypt, to be precise. So there were these famous monasteries that go back many, many years. The Anchor's Papyri, again, have talked about that. There, some of the things that are there are, there's a list of them that I can share with you if you'd like, but there's a site that lists them, and they have, from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, there's parts of Matthew, Mark, John, Romans, First Epistle of John. There's also texts from Psalms, Genesis, and other books, like the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas was a very influential book in the early church. They were some of the churches actually considered to be inspired, but it was not collective. It was not the consensus from the church. Didn't go that way. But it's a very influential book, very good read. And then also Irenaeus's writings. And Irenaeus had many good apologists. He had commentaries on different books of the gospel, on different themes of the gospel, and then also really good apologies against the enemies of the faith. There was the other monasteries like Wadi Nutram, and that's 120 miles north of Cairo. It's about halfway between Cairo and Alexandria, and it's still occupied. It's called Wadi Natrum, and it's still occupied. It's been occupied since the 4th century, which is the 300s AD, all the way to present, and it has distinctive churches, scriptoriums, which are libraries of scripts and other relics. So the liturgy of Egypt, the African Egypt church, the African Egyptian church, was developed by Saint Mark, of course, and then also later on by another African brother named Saint Cyril. He's one of the founders of the church, and he was one of the founders of the theologians of the Orthodox Church, and particularly of African Orthodoxy. And we'll talk a little more about that in just a moment. But it really features, it was translated into Coptic, by the 4th or 5th century. There's long Eucharistic prayers. And some of the Orthodox, the ancient African churches are part of the Orthodox Church, but they split from the rest of the Orthodox Church. We'll talk about that in a second. But that's one of the hallmarks of Orthodox liturgy is long prayers and lots of elaborate vestments and things like that, and an annual liturgical calendar. Actually, the early church, the center of the liturgy of the early church, the center of the worship service of the early church, actually was the Eucharist or the communion. So the early church actually took communion every time they met, and they considered the communion to be why they gathered together, to remember, to take part of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And then around that, they would build the liturgy, and they would build the prayers and so forth that were focused on the meaning and depth of meaning of the Eucharist. Now, in Protestantism, that's sort of reversed, where many Protestant churches sort of center around the worship service and then take communion sort of as almost, it's an integral part of the service, but it's almost an auxiliary in a way in many churches. But in the early church, that was the reverse. So that was the golden age of the church. The next section here of the church in African Egypt was from the 4th to the 7th centuries. And this is where a lot of the theology was articulated. Now, one of the things that will is that say that the Constantine, the Church of Nicaea, and the Coptic Church, but say Constantine and the Church of Nicaea, there's the assertion from secular people and from others that at Nicaea, that's where Christianity was invented, or that's where Jesus Christ was invented, or where he was declared to be God, or where the Bible was formulated, and put together and all of that. Actually, none of that is true. None of that is true. What the councils actually did was that the councils, including Nicaea, including Constantinople, including Ephesus, and those 3 councils in particular, what they did was that they clarified what the church already believed. So when Nicaea came, it was in response to a heretic named Arius, and 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 what the church did was that it clarified the faith that hit the doctrines of Jesus Christ, that what the scripture said about Jesus Christ from the very beginning, and also through the apostles, and it clarified what the church already believed and put it into a sort of a formula or a way to recite it so that everyone could understand it. And that's really what came out of these churches, these church councils. It wasn't the invention of doctrine, it was the clarification of doctrine and the thinking about how to articulate doctrine, so that it could be clear, so that it could be accurate, and so that it could be easily learnable and teachable to others. So what happened was again, there Athanasius, the African theologian, he was a pivotal, he played a pivotal role there in helping articulate that Jesus Christ is God, that he's not a creation. And then later on, his articulations of the Holy Spirit and who he is became his writings there. Those became part of the Nicene and Constantinople Creed. So we talked about monasticism. Some of the uh, actual other discoveries would be things like there's a St. Anthony's Monastery on the Red Sea. It still stands today. The Nag Hammadi codices in 1945. These are a large collection of Christian texts from the early church that go back uh, way into the first centuries of the church. And it talks about the diversity of Egyptian Christian thought. And some of it is, not all of it is completely scriptural. Some of it is speculations by people, these sort of secondary works that are commentaries, that some of them are more accurate than others, but they actually do show what the diversity of thought is, and then how deeply that Christianity had become into the culture of African Egypt at that time. So there was now what happened next was a big pivotal moment in the church. So after Constantinople in 381, after Nicaea in 325 AD, after Constantinople in 381 AD, there was the Council of Ephesus in 431, and followed by the Council of Chalcedon. Now, what had happened in Antioch, starting a couple of hundred years earlier, sorry, there was a man named Paul of Samosata who started teaching in Antioch things that really departed from the faith of the apostles, in that around the nature of Christ. So Jesus Christ in the Bible is always spoken, he is God and man at the same time. He's fully God and fully man at the same time. But he's spoken of always, Jesus walked on the water, Jesus healed, uh, Jesus wept, Jesus raised the dead, Jesus healed every sick person in a particular village or so forth. Jesus fed 5,000 or 4,000 people on different occasions, or men only, and probably 8 to 10,000 people on different occasions. So what happened was that he started talking about, Paul of Samosata started talking about Jesus as being two, separate God, separate man. And that was condemned, actually, at first. It was condemned. But what happened was that this thinking started spreading in the church. And and then there were people, including Pope Leo, one of the popes of Rome, Pope Leo. He was around in the 450s, where he tried to come up with these sort of compromises and ended up uh, postulating two separate natures in Jesus Christ after the incarnation. That was something that the African Egyptian church had seen as being different from what going beyond what the apostles had actually taught. And so they wanted to stick with what the apostles had taught, because they don't, like the Bible doesn't talk in terms of Jesus, God nature did this and Jesus, human nature did that. It talks about Jesus did this or Jesus did that. So that was the conception that they wanted to stay, and it's called miaphysite. It's not monophysite, it's miaphysite, meaning that God has, just like we have our mother and father, they contribute to us. But when we do something, we may get talent from one or the other. But when we do something, it's us doing it. It's not like the mother part of us doing this and the father part of us doing that, right? So with that, the African church in Chalcedon, there was a what's called a diaphysite, and it started speaking about God in Jesus Christ in two natures after the incarnation. And so that is what caused the African Egyptian church and the African um, uh, Axiomite church, like the African churches, to split away because they wanted to stay with the original formulations and the original thinking that the early church had from the beginning. So in that sense, in that area, and the African church had been more faithful and closer to what the apostolic model was over several centuries. Now, after Chalcedon, they had several other. They kind of realized, well, we went a little too far, and then they had several other church councils to kind of reconcile the language back closer to what it had been traditionally from the beginning. But the African churches actually stayed with the original conceptions, and now they're both, you know, very close. So then, what happened was there was a decline when the Muslim invasion started happening. There was wars actually between the Chalcedonian churches, which were in the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which is east of um, in Constantinople and Turkey and those places, and the African churches. They started actually fighting one another, which is another pretty bad part of church history. What happened actually is unfortunately, after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius I. He was a successor to Constantine. What Constantine did was that he legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, and then Theodosius actually made it the official religion. Now, what happened was after that, unfortunately, once that came, the emperors and the bishops started becoming a lot more cozy. Emperors started appointing bishops, and the church began to look more like the hierarchical government of the world, and that's something that kind of persisted for many centuries. And along with that, they decided to impose their particular articulation, the Chalcedon articulation that the African churches had rejected, wanted to impose it on Chalcedon, and they started basically killing some of the African Christians. About 10,000 African Christians died, Egyptian Christians died, but they held on to their faith and continued to practice this African expression, understanding Christianity that had come from the apostles a little more closely. So then the yeah, and then what happened was that because then the Muslim invasion started, and we'll get into this a little later as to why the African Egyptian church survived the advent of Islam and why other churches did not. And there were two churches that survived, which is the African Egyptian church, and then also the modern Ethiopian church. And then there were two that ended up disappearing, almost pretty much disappearing, which was the Northern Church, the Northern African Church around Libya and Carthage, and then also the Nubian Church in Sudan. But we'll get into the factors of that a little later. So now let's move from Egypt to Sudan, and then and in fact we can take a let's see, it's about yeah, we can take a. Do you want to take a quick 5-minute break? Okay. Okay, so now let's move to Nubia, which is the Bible Ethiopia, which is modern Sudan and South Sudan, and the Christian kingdoms there. So before the spread of Christianity, Nubia, as we know, have studied yesterday, it was home to powerful kingdoms, including Kush, and that was centered at Meroe, which is 200 kilometers or so northeast of Khartoum. And then later, it turns out that the kingdom of Cush and Ethiopia in the Bible were not just one kingdom. They referred to Sudan and South Sudan, that area, the southern part of Egypt, but also that was several different kingdoms in its own right. One is called Nabatea, and that was the capital of that kingdom was in Faras, which is named Pakoris. It's in northern Sudan, Lower Nubia, and it included the kingdoms of Makuria, and Makuria was northern Sudan and southern Egypt. So it crossed the modern borders into southern African Egypt, and the capital there was in Dongola. And then there was another kingdom within Ethiopia, Kush, which was called Alodia, and Alodia is in central and South Sudan, and the capital is Soba. Of that was Soba near Khartoum.
Right,
So,
do you know the what is one?
okay,
July 4th.
okay, hold on. I had to mute real quickie. All right. So these societies at the time, before Christianity came, practiced these very complex polytheistic religions, and they were influenced a lot by the pharaonic dynasties in Egypt. And so they had cultural ties with Egypt and also with sub-Saharan Africa. And it turns out that there were actually two hubs in Christianity, in early Christianity, pre-European Christianity. The first hub or center was, of course, African Egypt around Alexandria. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. All right. Okay, so got a request to turn on the AI summary. I'm not sure. I haven't used that before, so we'll see how it works. All right, so okay, so there were two centers of Christianity, uh, very major centers. One, of course, was African Egypt, and in African Egypt there was the 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 influence of African Egypt went into Europe, it went into Asia, and then also it went south into Africa. There was also a hub or a center of Christianity, which was in Sudan, in biblical Ethiopia. And this actually went north. There was some influence southern, but also a hub. This is the hub from which Christianity actually went west into the Sahel area at that time. So this was a very powerful and very influential Christian kingdom. And again, it lasted for 200 years, 1,200 years. Right. So what happened was that they also, because they had this polytheistic religion, but it was based around, it had some of the core concepts that Christianity clarified for the world, which is one supreme God, and then also the idea of resurrection. And so those made it a little easier or made it more natural in a way, not always easier, but made it more natural for the people, believing those things to take the next step and to believe in the true God and the true Christ with the true resurrection and understand that God cares about people and he's not this impersonal deity that's up in the sky somewhere and never interacts with human beings and never acts with his never interacts with his creation. But God actually, with Jesus Christ, he did far beyond that, which is he became one with his creation. He became one of his creation while still remaining fully God. So that gospel message spread, and it entered after the Ethiopian eunuchs from several centuries later. So it started with the Ethiopian eunuch, who was a servant of, or one of the high officials of Candace the queen, Kandake the queen. So it came into Egypt in force in the 6th century. It came from Egypt in force really in the 6th century, both through diplomatic and missionary efforts. So there were two actually competing strains or threads, if you will. There were two competing schools of Christianity that came into Sudan at that time. And this was from the Chalcedon, where we had already talked about briefly about the Council of Chalcedon, but there were the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians. There were the Diophysites who expressed their faith in God and Jesus Christ in two natures, and then the Miaphysites, who said that Jesus is both God and fully man, but he has one composite nature. And these two schools of Christianity were actually being promoted by a husband and wife team. There was Justinian and Theodora, who were emperor and empress at that time. And Justinian was a Chalcedonian. Theodora was a non-Chalcedonian, or Miaphysite. And so both of them sent their own missionaries into Sudan to try to to try to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ from both of those perspectives. So it actually did, and there was a man named Julian. This was this bishop of Eleutheropolis. Sorry, this is a Eleutheropolis. I've been practicing that word all night, and I still haven't gotten it quite right. Eleutheropolis in modern Palestine. So they were sending missionaries to Nabatea, which is in Sudan, around 543 AD, right? And so there was the conversion of Murakia, that kingdom, the kingdom of Murakia and the kingdom of Alodia, that followed those missionary efforts. And then, so there's archaeological evidence also from Faras, Kasser Ibrim, and Dongola. So, and what that evidence shows is that the Christianization of Africa, of Sudan in particular, excuse me, Nubia, happened very quickly. And so it became a Christian nation, and again lasted for 1,200 years. And there's archaeological evidence of churches that they've dug up. There are monasteries. There are Christian inscriptions, and that replaced the earlier Nubian religious forms. So these polytheistic forms that they had gotten from Egypt and other countries, they were replaced over time with Christian forms and Christian art and Christian liturgies and so forth. So in terms of the churches, the practices, and the art, the Nubian churches, the churches in Sudan, adapted both Coptic and Byzantine liturgies. So that's because of and Byzantine, of course, having to do with the eastern half of the Roman Empire. That's the Byzantium. And then the Diophysite, or the two-nature Christology, from that tradition. And then there's also the Coptic, which is the Miaphysite or composite nature tradition from Africa, from the African Egyptian Christians. And then both of these schools took hold and flourished in Nubia. And there were liturgies based around both of those traditions. So there's frescoes from a cathedral at Faras. They're now in Warsaw, but they depict biblical scenes, saints, bishops, and they illustrate the blending of this African tradition, the Byzantine Coptic Christians, and also iconography. What different traditions and regions of Christianity developed icons, and icons are really, you can think of them almost like photographs of deceased relatives that you want to remember and honor and keep their memories alive. And back then, of course, there were no photographs, because that was 1,500 years ago. So what they did was they did these paintings or drawings or inscriptions of the different saints that they wanted to remember, and then those are, of course, what are called icons, and each different region of Christianity developed its own iconographic style. So in modern Ethiopian Aksum, you'll see a specific, a distinct style of icon. In the Byzantine and Eastern Orthodox tradition, you'll see a different, distinct style of icon. And then in the Nubian tradition or the Sudanese, ancient Sudanese tradition, there were combinations of that, but also a distinct style that grew out of that tradition as well of the faith. So another thing that happened was that just like in African Egypt, in Sudanese Christianity or Nubia, there was monasticism and it flourished. There was a monastic movement. The monks were highly thought of and uh, looked upon as role models for the faith. And so there was bishops from Dongola that maintained close ties with the Coptic patriarch in Alexandria. The Nubian the Nubian church leadership was actually sort of installed and maintained by the Alexandrian church, by the African Egyptian church in Alexandria. And so there's, again, uncovers of excavations have shown things, the church complexes, not just single buildings, but entire complexes, marble altars that they offered on, and a wealth of Christian manuscripts in Greek, Coptic, and Old Nubian. So initially, the Greek and Coptic were the liturgical languages of the Nubian church, but over time, those liturgies and writings started becoming translated into Old Nubian. And that's one of the things that helped the faith to hold on for as long as it did. So the Arabs conquered, the Arabs started doing their conquests early on in around the 650s or so forth. There was a Arab conquest of Egypt in 652. And what happened was that at that time, there was a sort of a unique relationship between Muslim Egypt and Christian Nubia. And there were still remnants of Christianity, strong remnants of Christianity in Egypt after the Arabs came, in African Egypt after the Arabs came. But one thing that did happen was sort of uh, a choking off, if you will, of leadership from the Alexandrian church to the Nubian church over time. So then, it, and eventually, with other factors that we'll discuss in a little later on, it became where the actual church sort of disappeared around the 15th century as a whole. But still, in southern Sudan, there were remnants of the church going back into the 17th that lasted a couple hundred years later into the 17th century after the main body of Christianity had disappeared, in Sudan in the north. So there were again three kingdoms from the sixth to the in medieval Nubia, the Christian kingdoms of the Middle Nile. Uh, these lasted around these highlighted around from the 6th to the 16th centuries. And there were three of them, as we talked about, Nabatea, Makuria, and Alodia. And these things, we actually talked about some of these already. I got ahead of myself a bit, and we talked about these already. And so then we can move on to some of the manuscripts. Uh, we talked about the Coptic and Byzantine. The bishops of Nubia were usually consecrated or often consecrated by the Coptic patriarch in Alexandria. And so these were the leading bishops, and they appointed other bishops. But what happened was that there were also local clergy, priests, and monks that played a vital role in the rural and urban life. And one of the things that helped Christianity to last and to spread and to last as long as it did is the rural populations were also Christians, and it wasn't just a city-centered, government-centered type of faith, where like it was in the North. We'll talk about that in a bit. So some of the liturgical manuscripts and books, letters, legal documents, a lot of those are both governmental, but also are influenced by Christianity, because Christianity played a high part, a strong part in the state of Nubia and ancient Sudan. And then there's legal documents, and then then the administrative and regular languages had changed to be more Christian reflective over those times. So the murals, for instance, the liturgical art would have scenes of, like, say, for instance, the Pharos Cathedral of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, apostles, and also they show Nubian bishops, which is which is localized and very unique and very important, to keep the faith going. And then also they're dressed in the regalia of church and court. So just like in Europe, they had these very elaborate paintings and artwork and so forth. They had the same sorts of parallel Nubian, Sudanese focused artwork for the Christians in Nubia. So then again, monasticism was a very, very one of the centers of monasticism. Several of the centers of monasticism were flourishing around the Nile and in the semi-desert regions. Now, in Egypt, there was a contrast, because in Egypt there was monasticism, that monks that went off into these very kind of barren deserts by themselves, and the monasticism in Nubia or Sudan really flourished mostly along the Nile and in sort of semi-desert regions. So there's Old Gondola, Dongola, Dongola, Old Dongola, sorry, and Ghazali, in Dongola, yeah, Old Dongola and Ghazali. They have extensive complexes with churches, libraries, communal refectories, and almost like these monastic communities, like developed in Israel as well. In During the time, where they had the Essene communities in Israel. So these were kind of parallel to those, but they developed independently. So Christianity was a shape. It really was sort of the thread and heartbeat of the society. So the law, the marriage, the burial customs, Christian cemeteries that were marked with crosses and gravestones and Greek or Old Nubian, and they found those through Sudan and southern Egypt. Again, it's concentrated more in the north and in the central, but there was definitely presence in the south as well. And so you've got land grants and biblical and local laws that were taken, influenced by like the Old Testament law and the laws of the Bible, to how to conduct commerce and how to conduct ordinary affairs of business in the society. So there was what's called in 652, there's called the Bakht Treaty. And this is around and what that did was to sort of have peaceful relations. What the Nubian kings and priests did, and bishops, they had this sort of negotiated peace with the Muslims. And that lasted a while. Now, what happened eventually, under Muslim law, non-Muslims had to pay taxes, right? So if you were not a Muslim, you had to pay a special non-Muslim tax. And so that became sort of a burden. That became a burden on the Nubian Christian society after a while. But at least for centuries, it was able to go ahead and survive and not be conquered by the Muslim armies that were there, and not even really have to fight them. But later on, there were invasions. Things started to decline. There were invasions. The trade rights had shifted, and as we saw in Bible days, Nubia was a very important center of commerce. And actually, the Nubian, the Sudanese kings, and pharaohs and things actually ended up ruling parts of across the Red Sea in Yemen. that was part Ethiopian. That was under Ethiopian control for some time as well. But and there were trade routes, and those things changed over time. And so usually, so then the kingdoms that we were talking about in Nikuria and Nabatea, those were they were really the major ones, and they were eventually absorbed into the Islamic sultanates. And this happened by the 15th century. Alodia lasted longer, but it fell by the 16th century. And then again in southern Sudan, up to the 16th, 17th century, there were still some enclaves of Christianity that ended up eventually disappearing as well, especially in the remote areas. And there are oral traditions and occasional finds that archaeologists are finding that actually speak to the people of the book in ancient days. Even though the people don't necessarily practice Christianity anymore, they'll have Christian relics, they have Christian crosses, they talk about people of the book, and they have this communal ancestral memory of when Christianity was there. So later on, in Nubia, the Twa was that let's see was came from Islamization. I actually want to move on a little bit here, and kind of skip the decline. But after but during the decline, this decline area, the decline period from say the 13th to the 16th centuries, it still does. There's still a lot of artifacts there in pottery, funeral stela, and stela are these posts that they have. They're like a monument, like a pole. The large vertical pole, and they have inscriptions around them, and they tell a lot of stories and encapsulate and preserve the history of and also traditions and practices of that time. They're very important, like in Pharaonic history for it's studying Egyptian history, and some of those have actually validated different points of fact in the Bible. So the elites started in Nubian society started adopting Islam for like political and economic reasons. They were the first ones to actually be absorbed into Islam. And the ordinary people for a long time retained the Christian customs, the saints, for generations afterwards. And so in remote parts of the Southern Nile and certain people, Christian influence can actually be traced in oral traditions even to even later periods, even though these continual church structures disappeared. And so the foundation, the core foundation was eroding for Christianity at that time, but there were still peripherals, and people practicing the faith without the large communities and without the large churches and so forth. But eventually that ended up sort of dying out. So some of the highlights for archaeology in the Sudan and southern Sudan area is like the Faras Cathedral, and this is 8th to 14th centuries with the bishops and so forth. Old Dongola, and then Qasr Ibrahim, and this is ruins for continual. These are ruins there that really show a continuity from the pre-Christian temples to Christian churches with Christian burials and imported liturgical objects from different areas, whether they be from modern Ethiopia, from African Egypt, and so forth. And so now let's move briefly to pre-colonial Christianity in West Africa. So the Nubian kingdom was one of the hubs for spreading a lot of Christianity across Africa to the West before the Europeans got there. And so the influence of Nubia actually reached all the way west to Lake Chad. So the Chad and Niger area uh, there were Christians out there, and there's still Christian uh, ruins and Christian artifacts, and also Christian customs from people that used to be Christian and no longer are. but it shows that the presence of Christianity back then. Now, it was more intermittent than it was, so there weren't whole swaths of Christianity in an entire kingdom like there were in Nubia, in Sudan. Um, and the Christianity came into West Africa actually from a couple of different directions. One was, of course, coming from the east, from Nubia going west. Another one was from the north, from the Carthage and Cyrenian Christians, the North African Christians coming south, because what happened was two things were that there were invasions from the Muslims, actually, that where people fled, but also there were persecutions from other Christians. So there were, like for instance, in the northern uh, areas in North Africa, there was called the Donatist movement, and this was a movement that was actually condemned as a heresy by the Roman Church, but this was a popular movement of people who were sort of like ultra fundamentalists and wanted the priests to be only be able to serve the Eucharist if they were living very holy lives and that kind of thing. So but when they were started getting persecuted, and when the um, Muslims started invading in those areas, some of these Christians actually fled the area and went south, and they ended up in the Sahel and other areas, around Lake Chad, that area too. So that's where more of these types of influences came. Now, the West African church didn't take hold to the same degree that the churches did in other parts of Africa that we've discussed already. And it came in spurts. It came in different localities as opposed to large regions. But the evidence and the influence persisted even after those Christians had died, and actually after the Christian traditions formally had disappeared. So there's also trans-Saharan trade routes that came in. For instance, in Mali, there were Christians that were in the kingdom, say, of Mansa Musa, and there are fragmentary evidence and fragmentary writings about that, actually by Muslims and by Muslim traders and Muslim writers, Muslim government like bureaucrats that wrote about them and happened to mention that there were Christians and Jews among them. This is part of Christianity that is hard to recover for two reasons. One is because there were a minority of Christians there, and also the writings that are there were in Arabic, say in the Mali Kingdom, where Mansa Musa, and unfortunately, in Bible studies, you have Bible historians, you have Egyptologists, and even between the two of them, they don't really communicate, their scholarly works and collaborate a lot, so that there's some synergies that are missing in the scholarship to bring out some of these things and some of this history. And then that's exacerbated by most of them not really studying Arabic because they're studying either Egypt, or they're studying like ancient Egypt, African Egypt, or they're studying Christianity in the Bible lands, in the Holy Lands. And so they don't really learn Arabic and become expert in Arabic to be able to go through these documents from from Mali and West Africa to be able to discover some of the Christian presence that could be discovered if they put that kind of effort into it. But the presence of Christianity, uh, pre-European Christianity, has been seen in Mali as well. And so okay. Now we want to go. Okay, so we're kind of running a little close to the end of class. So we want to do two brief mentions. One is the Kingdom of Congo and West Central Africa. Now, technically, this isn't pre-European Christianity. Everything else that we've discussed is pre-European Christianity. It has nothing to do with European Christianity at all. Congo is a bit unique when it comes to European influence of Christianity, because what they did was in around the 1490s, the Portuguese came and the kingdom of Congo was converted. That the king, he became known as King Alfonso the First. It became a Christian. It became a Christian kingdom, and what they did though was that they actually started um, localizing and adapting the gospel message to the needs of the people and to the cultural experience of the Congolese at that time. And this is Congo with a K. It's not the Democratic Republic of Congo. That would be the Democratic Republic of Congo as we know it today, is the uh, the easternmost part of the Kingdom of Congo. And Congo goes farther to the west, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, around there. So there was a huge, huge influence back at that time. And so what happened was that they actually started adapting and culturalizing, localizing the gospel message to the needs of the people there, and we're working with some Portuguese missionaries who were also doing that as well. So they adopted it, like they had their own royal court. They had schools. They had communication, with the European Christians, with the Vatican and so forth. But they didn't really, but they had their own localized um, experience, their own localized Christian experience. Now that kind of went south very fast. It uh, went badly very fast because that's where the Europeans actually started the slave trade, and that kind of ruined things. But for a while there was that indigenous practice and uh, adaptation, localization of the Christian message. So, with our last few minutes, I want to talk a bit about why why things happened. Let's see here. Scroll down here. Okay, just a second. Okay, so want to kind of skip to the topic of why did the churches in ancient Sudan, Ethiopia, and Cyrene and Carthage disappear, and in African Egypt and in Axum, which is modern Ethiopia, why did those continue? So, and this is something that we can learn from history. One of the benefits of studying history and one of the necessities of studying history is to learn from the past the things that went well and to learn from the past the things that didn't do well so we can avoid those mistakes and so that we can be so we can benefit from the learning of the past and avoid the mistakes of the past. So really there are uh, one thing that is a principle is that the theology that we believe is always in some way culturally contingent. So either it's influenced by the culture that we get it from, or it's influences the culture that we're in, or it's influenced by the culture that we're in. So some examples of this are like in Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So the Roman Catholic and Orthodox, their ecclesial sort of practice and polity are influenced by the imperial structure of the Roman Empire, including the way that their bishopric and their hierarchy, their ecclesiastical hierarchies are set up, and some of the priorities that they have in the way that they do things. Whereas the African independent churches, or AICs, or African initiated churches, African indigenous churches, are really responses to ecclesiologies for their own cultural context. Many of those churches were originated from a desire for freedom, just like here in the U.S. The Black church or the African American church was has a different type of focus than the mainstream white churches, because we were formed in the underground churches where we wanted to have both sides of the Bible apply, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, salvation, the teachings of heaven and hell, holy living, but also social justice and how the faith lives out in society and makes society better. because people are changed, and because people are changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ to make society better. So that's the cultural infrastructure where the faith is being applied. So that is similar to the infrastructure of colonialism that was being thrown out by, and then the African independent churches wanted to be seen, that Jesus Christ loves us, that we are equal to anybody else, and then have this movement that's going on till today. So now with that, there's four different um, legs of the church that are essential for churches to succeed long term. And this is one of the papers that I had sent out with the syllabus to Dean Peter for you. And it's a paper by Joshua Barron, and he's a wonderful professor. He's like a mentor of mine, and he is in Kenya. He lives in Kenya, but he wrote this. He's a deep expert on African Christianity and wrote this very insightful paper that applies to Christianity anywhere in the world. And there's four things that the paper highlights. One is local leadership. Another one is a vision for participation in God's mission, to be able to spread the gospel, but also to be able to reach ordinary people and to be able to be a help and an aid to ordinary people. The use of vernacular scripture, which is scripture in the local language, and then also prayer. So prayer is the foundation of everything. So the way it describes it is, if a camel in the bush or desert's lost a leg, then one of these legs, or if it's lost a leg, it's not going to survive. Likewise, if one of these legs is missing, it makes it very difficult for a church to survive. So let's take a look at all four different areas. So one is in North Africa and Cyrene and Carthage geographies. There's a second paper that I had attached to the syllabus by a brother named Calvin Shank, and he describes how he basically summarizes why these churches had the outcome that they did over time. So in Northern Africa, one of the problems that had to disappear is there was inadequate evangelization, meaning that there was no outreach. It was sort of basically a religion of Roman immigrants, right? The Romans came into that area. They set up their churches. They really didn't try to include the native Africans there, the Berbers and so forth, or even the Phoenicians, the Phoenician ancestry, the Punics there. But they basically set it up and they said, look, you know, they didn't really try to evangelize. They got in league pretty much with the government, and they started. They didn't have any real effort to try to reach Berbers, and then also they didn't have any scriptures in the language of the native Africans at all. So what happened was that they were sort of like uh, a church of bishops and hierarchies and authority and channels and that sort of thing. And whereas the African societies themselves were more egalitarian, the more equal, where leaders and the laity were more on the same level, and so that really failed to really adapt to the specifics of the culture that they were in. There were no real languages, no attempt. Now, what happened is one of the reasons that Islam succeeded, where Christianity disappeared in North Africa, is Islam it presented itself as the opposite way. It presented itself as a religion of the people. And one of the things that Dean Peter um, had shared with me, we had a conversation a while back, and I've never forgotten this, but he said that one of the differences between Islam and Christianity and the missionaries and so forth in Sudan is that the the missionaries in Sudan, the Christian missionaries, tended to package everything up, pay for everything, do everything, build everything, but they didn't show the Sudanese brothers and sisters how to do it themselves, right? It's like giving someone fish instead of teaching them how to fish, right? And so what the Islam did is that it helped empower people to do things on their own. And so that is actually that dynamic that Dean Peter described today about what happened with the Christian churches and the Islamic missions today is exactly what happened 1,500 years ago in Northern Africa, is that it became original. Islam came uh, where Christianity was a religion of the immigrants or the colonizers and so forth, and of the elite. Then Islam was a religion of the people. It empowered people. Also, with a high emphasis on literacy, and and they didn't necessarily translate their works into the native languages, but they helped the people to learn Arabic, which is, the second best thing. And also, what they did is and so that's what happened. So, as far as these four legs of the camel in North Africa, uh, the local leadership they didn't have visionary for participation in God's mission to spread the gospel to help people. They didn't have that. The church didn't have that there. Use of vernacular scripture, in their own language, they didn't have that. And the only thing they had really was prayer, and they killed that. They tried to stomp out the local expression of Christianity and keep it with their own instead of trying to teach the people that were Donatists how to become more orthodox. What they did was they just persecuted the Donatists and tried to get rid of them. All right, so that's why Christianity disappeared. In northern Africa. Now, in Nubia, Sudan, it it's not quite as clean because it lasted a lot longer, right? In northern Sudan, in northern Africa, it lasted about 400 years, in or 2 to 400, 3 to 400 years. In Nubia, Sudan, it lasted 1,200 years. So it's not like it was not successful and didn't take hold. But why it eventually disappeared is a few things. Like one is a lack of church leadership and autonomy. So they never had a patriarch like African Egypt had, or modern Ethiopia, Axum. They became their own patriarch. What happened was that whereas the bond or channels between African Egypt and Axiom, modern Ethiopia, those channels were allowed to remain. Unfortunately, what happened with Nubia and Sudan is that the communication between Alexandria, between African Egypt and Sudan, got choked off and cut off by by the Muslims. And that really, and because there was no local leadership, no local bishops, hierarchy, they were all appointed by Alexandria, and Ethiopia would not, modern Ethiopia, Axum, would not provide those leaders. Then the lack of leadership, that leadership vacuum took a real toll. There was also too strong church and state. Kings in Sudanese Christianity held priestly status. Priests made political decisions. So kings could conduct liturgies and church services, and priests could make laws and rules and things like that. So influencing the government is fine. To influence the government in a more humane direction, in a relation that's good for people, that's okay. But when it gets too tight and you can't tell the difference anymore, that is entanglement is not okay. So it was, start of church leadership. And what happened was that this vacuum started to appear as the society started kind of decaying as well. And all kingdoms do this. They sort of come to a point where they start to fall apart. And when that happened, the Islam filled the gap and stepped into that vacuum. Another thing too is that there wasn't much evangelism. So there wasn't, even though it caught on in much of the popular uh, population, there was once that happened, there wasn't a continued emphasis on evangelism, on spreading the faith, on renewing the faith, on reviving the faith, and so forth. So, and also there was no Nubian Sudanese Bible. for centuries. So even though it started there in the fourth or fifth century, fifth and sixth century, it was the ninth and tenth century when Coptic and Greek were already established, that the Nubian scriptures came out, and really that the Coptic and Greek liturgies had already taken hold then, and it wasn't as easy for the Nubian scriptures to take hold. And also there was the monastic tradition started to fade. And that's important in Africa for some reason. So even though there was monasticism in the beginning, it started to fade. And when the monastic community started to fade, those role models that the people looked to uh, weren't there anymore, and it was harder for people to keep that vision. So as far as these four legs of the camel, local leadership, they did have local leadership, except at the top, right? So at the top, the leadership was from outside. Um, so they didn't really have local leadership from that from that perspective. They also lost the vision for participation in God's mission and for spreading the gospel to other people and to help people. They did have the use of vernacular scripture in their own language, but it was a bit too late. And prayer and liturgy, they had prayer. That's one thing they did have, because they lasted for 1,200 years, and that is a lot of prayer. So even though it did end up disappearing, 1,200 years is a long time, and that was a very, very rich and powerful tradition and impactful tradition of Christianity. So in African Egypt, uh, very quickly, what happened was that they stayed, again, the most faithful to the teachings handed down by the apostles. After Chalcedon, they stayed with the apostolic teaching, whereas the rest of the church sort of went the new way. Um, they ended up doing a lot of evangelism to ordinary people from the beginning, and they stayed with that throughout, and they still do that today. They had scriptures in their native languages from very early on. And then monasticism was very powerful. The leadership, since it was a patriarchy, there was obviously local leadership, and they actually were the leaders of most of the African church. So in the four legs of the camel, they had them all. They had the local leadership, which was the patriarchy, which was equality even with Rome, um, this vision, vernacular scripture, and prayer. And then same thing with modern Ethiopia. They had widespread evangelization, reaching ordinary people. Even though the king was converted, there was a big push there to be able to reach everyone. They didn't stay Coptic. They became Axumite in modern Ethiopia, and they now have their own patriarchy. They localized their literature, architecture, art, and then they had a better church and state balance. Even though church and state, there was like the official religion of Ethiopia was Christianity, they didn't tie it so closely together that each started to smother and interfere with the other. They also had some, indigenous monasticism there as well. So just to wrap up, um, to learn from this and make the church in South Sudan prosper and continue to prosper, and to prosper even more, uh, we need to focus on those four legs of the church. And you can have a fifth leg, maybe, if we think about it this way, is to understand the importance of Sudan and Ethiopia in the Holy Scriptures, both in the history of the Bible itself, but also this rich tradition of Christianity in Africa as a whole, in Sudan in particular, that can help inspire us, and that we can look at the lessons that from the past and look at the future, to keep that focus on the faith, to keep that focus on the Word of God, on reaching people in their own language, on their own, with their own needs and situations, adapting the gospel message to help communicate it to them in a way that they can understand and they can help them. And to keep that and to keep that fire and zeal to keep spreading the word of God, so that the word of God can grow and continue to grow. Evangelism is something we need to do, but also something we need to maintain as well to keep that fire.